when studying research ethics, we have the fundamental question of what do we actually mean by ethics? What kind of ethics are research ethics? And spending a little bit of time online, you'll probably find there are lots of different versions of ethics. There's lots of different ideas about what ethics are. And the purpose of this video is to try and tease out a few of those and to look at the way in which research ethics works in practice against some of these ideas of what ethics actually means. So ethics, in its normal meaning, is about choice. It's about the choices that we make every day, and it's about the principles and guidelines that govern those choices. We can see it distinct from the idea of legality, which is about conformity with the rules of a legal system, or morality, which is about compliance with the codes of others, of a religion or a set of beliefs or whatever. Ethics is much more focused on ourselves and the decisions we make. And those concepts of legality and morality are going to be connected to that, but it's not the end of the story. They're all interconnected. Now, the Ethics Centre defines ethics in the following way. Ethics aims to answer one big question: how should I live? Ethical beliefs shape the way we live, what we do, what we make, and the world we create through our choices. Ethical questions explore what Aristotle called a life well lived. And I'll put the link to the Ethics Centre in the notes below this video. So, sounds good so far, but it's used differently in different contexts. We tend to think about ethics as sort of an internal code of honour or a code of beliefs. But we also use the term ethics when we're talking about regulation of groups through formal or informal code of ethics. We talk about professional ethics, and that may be an informal sense of this is what you should or shouldn't do, and they can sometimes be written down as codes of ethics that have compliance and they have procedures and they have penalties if you breach those codes, and they end up looking more like legislation than necessarily any kind of individual or personalised code. And some of those ideas may even contradict that idea of basic goodness, because the idea of complying with a set of rules that you're told what to do is different to being basically a good person and doing what is the right thing to do. So in law, we have the legal codes of ethics, we have laws of professional, we have the codes of professional conduct, and as admitted lawyers, we can be expunged from the profession for those sorts of breaches. But they tend to mix up the idea of ethics as goodness with all kinds of professional codes and business codes and restrictive business codes about not interfering with other people's business or not stepping outside of the lines of that prescribed idea of what it is to be a barrister or a solicitor. So sometimes they go well beyond the idea of ethics as goodness and good behaviour and good decisions, and move into that field of ethics as a controlling mechanism to control a professional group. So we have a sort of an onion shell arrangement here of different ideas of ethics. On the outside, there's this idea of ethics as general goodness. And then we think, well, maybe it's sometimes, in certain circumstances, it's about a code of regulation, a code of conduct. Then we move into the idea of ethics as compliance. It's about complying with codes. And then at some point, ethics might be about obedience, about following what you're doing, what you're told to do. And there, you are a long way away from the idea of ethics as basic goodness. So there are different types of ethics historically, and this video is not going to be able to go into all the different theories of ethics, but I'll touch on a few basic terms and concepts that are useful to know. The first is teleological ethics. And this is the original concept of ethics, and it goes to the idea of looking at the outcomes of your actions and always doing good through the outcomes of what you do, and it's about looking at the final result. Now, obviously, that form of ethics can be dangerous because it can enter that mindset of the ends justify the means, and the response to this is a much higher standard that is suggested, which is called deontological ethics. And that is, you have to have the right means and the right ends. You can never do something a little bit ethically sort of dubious with the aim that at the end of the day, everything's going to be okay because you've got a good result because of what you did. I mean, Goebbels famously said you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. Or maybe he didn't say it, maybe it's just attributed to him. But is that idea that, you can justify a lot of very terrible things if you think that you're going to be justified at the end of the day. A deontological approach to ethics says that's not good enough. You've got to be able to justify each of those individual steps along the way. Now, the higher standard of both of those two is virtue theory. And virtue theory argues that you not only have to have the right ends and use the right means, you have to do it for the right reasons. Now, this is a kind of standard that I think would be difficult for most people to meet in most of the time. But it means it's not good enough to do the right thing and to do the correct thing. You've got to be a good person, and you've got to do those for the right reasons. And it's not just about the fact that it's advantageous for you to do the right thing, it's advantageous for you to be seen as the kind of person who does the right thing. You really need to be the kind of person who does it for the right reasons. And that raises all kinds of questions about human nature, our ability to delude ourselves that we are something other than what we are. And it really does move us into sort of, I guess, questions of existentialism. Again, way beyond this video of what it is to have identity and what it is to be a person and what it is to act in the world. So we're not going to go too far down that rabbit hole, obviously. But just think about those three layers. The teleological layer, it's about the ends. Deontological, it's about the means and the ends. Virtue theory, it's about being a good person at the end of the day, however you judge that. Now, this has not been entirely unproblematic, of course, and one of the big problems we have is ethical relativity. And that's the idea that people with different upbringings, different cultures, different belief systems may have fundamentally different ideas about what is the right code of conduct. And there is a certain essentialism to a lot of ethical belief, that this idea that goodness is universal and everyone can recognize it. But obviously, in certain key areas, people are going to have, particularly in relation to forms of punishment or people's rights, people are going to have very, very different ideas. And even in the attempts post-World War II to forge a universal declaration of human rights that would apply to everyone, the idea of property became a sticking point with communist countries. Eventually they signed because they believed it was most important to have this declaration. But there was that issue of, well, is there a fundamental right to property? If you're a communist country, not there's so many of them anymore, but if you're a communist country, you don't necessarily believe that individuals should be able to control all the means of production and all these things that should belong to society as a whole. So ethical relativity is definitely a problem. And it's definitely one of those things that, to an extent, you have to make allowances that different people are going to have different ethical and belief systems. But there's also a danger it can sort of be used as a way of justifying bad behaviour, where you just say, well, that's just our culture, that's just our way. We like cruel punishments because that's the kind of culture that we have. And sometimes governments use cultural relativity as a way of concealing or sidestepping that idea of ethics. But let's get back to research ethics and why it's important. We have, and again, outside the scope of what we're going to talk about here, a pretty poor history of terrible things being done to people in the name of science. We have situations where people have, the least of which has been people being misled or deceived. We have situations where people suffering from illness had medicine withheld on the idea that they were a control group, and other people were given medicine. And of course, as with any issue where we're talking about lack of ethics, the Nazis do appear again, and the kind of experimentation that was done on human subjects in concentration camps was a very much an eye-opener for what happens with science without being driven by ethics. And those fundamental questions of what do you do with that research? Now, a lot of that research we adopted, and we took it on, and we say, particularly in terms of things that were useful for the space program. A lot of torture and death was useful in generating data and information that we would then use to make life safer for astronauts. And there's a very interesting ethical dilemma there in terms of, and this is the teleological versus deontological. I mean, once the harm's been done, what do you do with that research? What do you do? Can you use that research for good to help people, or should the fact that research was obtained in a terrible way taint that research forever, and should it be forgotten? Big interesting questions there. So there's been a lot of situations, big and small, where scientists, researchers, and so on have been fairly appalling in their research track record and the way they've treated people. And the most contemporary expression for us of a code of ethics that protects us from this kind of action is the Australian Code of Responsible Conduct of Research 2007. And that's something it's important for you to have an overview of as part of your studies. Not to know it in detail and not to know what all the sections are, but to give an idea of the sorts of things that are included. And this is the document that informs the ethical clearance processes that universities use when they look at proposed research and they have to sign off and say, we think this makes the cut ethically and we think it's fine. So it covers a lot of different things, but it covers things like making sure that participants consent to being a part of that research, and that consent is fully informed. You don't just say, I'm a doctor, I've got a white coat, I'm just going to stick some needles in you, trust me. You have to actually explain what the context of the research is, what's going to happen. Issues around disclosure and transparency around the research. A lot of early research, particularly psychology research, involved a lot of deception of people, making them think they were doing one thing when you were studying something else. Now we're uncomfortable about that sort of thing there today. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but there's a very difficult ethical process to go through to explain why you're having to deceive people as part of your research. There's also issues around record keeping, identification of people, confidentiality, and there's also other forms of harm and risk mitigation, more obviously in fields where there's medical research, where you can think about where someone could actually get hurt or be made sicker as part of the research. But for us as legal researchers too, there's a lot of issues of rights and fundamental relations with the legal system that might be jeopardised by research that is not conducted very carefully. And we also have the idea of the provision of assistance and support as part of the ethics process now. So finding ways where people are distressed by the research or things come up that you haven't foreseen, of having mechanisms whereby those people can get help, rather than just saying, well, thank you, you've answered all my questions, and walking away. So in the legal research context, there's a few different things that come up. So obviously criminality and the legal consequences of criminality are something that are going to have fairly major ethical ramifications. There's also the idea of vulnerability, of victims, people suffering from other harms, or people who are just suffering as a result of conflict. You don't want your research to actually make that conflict worse or to exacerbate the sort of harms people are suffering. There's also the fact that there might be undisclosed aspects of your research. There might be the issue of the release of information from that research and the security of that information. Again, when we're talking about people who might be talking about criminal activity, there's a very, very difficult ethical balance there between talking about criminality and the situations where researchers are going to be required under different legal schema to actually report that person. Usually the subject of research is treated confidentially, but it may be a situation where some of the mandatory reporting legislation comes into play and you are required to actually report what the person discloses. And more generally, your research may change the person's relationship with the legal system and how they view their rights and how they take future action. So if your research is, say, couched in terms of systemic bias against a group in society, and they know that, and they say, well, you're a member of a certain cultural group and we think that the legal system is biased against you, please tell us about it. You might actually be reinforcing that feeling of helplessness and that feeling of powerlessness, because the way your research is conducting is reinforcing those relations. So those are some of the broad ideas of how research ethics are likely to affect us in the legal research context. Undergraduate students, of course, usually don't have any opportunity to engage in primary research with individuals, but this is the sort of thing that can come in as part of an honours program. The thing that's interesting about the way in which these ideas become formalised in codes of ethics and in procedures is that we end up getting an interesting mix of two different ideas of what ethics are. On the one hand, this is the idea that we started with, which is ethics as goodness, ethics as doing no harm, ethics as providing public good and public benefit. On the other hand, we've got a whole series of procedures which are designed to protect the institution from being exposed to risk, to stopping the institution being sued by the subjects of research because your researchers went and exacerbated a problem or did harm. And again, we've got that dichotomy along the way of, is it about doing good or is it about following the rules to protect yourself and your organisation from some kind of penalty? And perhaps that doesn't matter. Perhaps at the end of the day, you have the same outcome, whether someone is doing the right thing because they think it's the right thing to do, or because they're scared that they might get sued or they might lose their job because of it. But it does make an interesting question on how we engage with the idea of ethics. Is it a matter of complying with the paperwork and just doing the minimum that you need to do to get by? Or does the ethical researcher go further and to think about the context in which their research operates and the good their research can do, and avoiding the harm that may happen, even though that may be harm that is something which is fine with the formal systems and the procedures of research ethics clearance. But what happens if my research gets misused? What if it's something that's in danger of reinforcing a bias or a prejudice in society? Some very interesting issues there, and I haven't been able to do complete justice to it in this short video, but I hope it's something that will give you some ideas to keep in mind going forward.